And I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Professor Adam Rose, who is from the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events at the University of Southern California, has extensive experience in analyzing and assessing economic consequences of various kinds of threats, both natural and human-made. Adam, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank Chris Wood for inviting me to this beautiful location and actually helping set up my talk, in that I'm sure if your experience is anything like mine, you haven't been able to pick up a book. And before I start, I'm wondering if my slide presentation hit one of those automatic forward linkages. I think it has. Is there some expert in PowerPoint?
I can fix it, but
yeah.
I don't think it did. I think you may have
okay.
bumped it, but let's see.
All right, let's see if it did. All right, sometimes it defaults to that. So as I was saying, if your experience is anything like mine, practically every book you've picked up has had the word resilience in the title, and here are a couple of examples. The book cover in the center is a book that was put out shortly after the 9/11 attacks, focusing on a retrospective of what happened from an economic perspective. The one on the left is a book of papers compiled by some planners who've looked at historical floods, earthquake, wars. It turns out that in the 25 papers in those two volumes, only one of them even bothered to try to define resilience. The third book cover here is actually front page of a report by the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank in the aftermath of Katrina, and there's a very short but vague definition of resilience. Now, since that time, there have been many more studies, and I especially refer you to the recent National Academy of Sciences report called Disaster Resilience: A National Imperative, which provides a pretty good definition, but it is the exception and not the rule. Now, more recently, we've had Hurricane Sandy, and half the newspapers articles I've seen also seem to use the word resilience. The problem with all of this is that resilience is in jeopardy of becoming a vacuous buzzword. And the danger there is it's just one of those things that's going to make people's eyes glaze over and simply ignore what is a very important topic. So I've devoted about the last 10 years of part of my research to answering these 5 key questions. And the first, is resilience a meaningful concept? And the answer is yes, most definitely, and most definitely from an economic perspective. Can resilience be rigorously defined? And the answer here again is yes. Can resilience be empirically measured? And what I want to do today is to provide a simple metric for estimating resilience and show how we've applied it. How effective has resilience been to date? Well, it's been very effective. And in fact, it's characterized by having very low cost of implementation. And next, can resilience be enhanced or depleted? And the answer here is most definitely you can build up resilience capacity in advance of an event. The ingenuity, and people say necessity is the mother of invention. There's a lot of ingenuity that takes place in the aftermath of a disaster that increases our resilience capability as well. At the same time, we can't be too smug about resilience. Hurricane Katrina showed us how resilience can be overwhelmed and eroded. So let me begin by talking about economic resilience. And here I'm going to present some general definitions. And it has a mind of its own here. Some general definitions and try to fuse some economic principles into them. And I might add, when I started this, I studied definitions of resilience from the standpoint of ecology, from engineering, from planning, from organizational behavior. And I found that there are more commonalities than there are differences, many more commonalities than differences. So let me begin by a simple definition of resilience: the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked. Well, The counterpart to this from the standpoint of economics is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time. So the heart of the economic problem is scarcity. That's why we have to use resources wisely, because they are in fact scarce. And a disaster makes them even more scarce. From a dynamic standpoint, the typical definition that many of you have heard, and I've made the static dynamic distinction here, the speed of a system to recover from a shock. So it's time related. Well, in a similar way, there's an economic counterpart to this. This is the efficient use of resources over time for investment in repair and reconstruction. So you really can't recover in practically all instances unless you invest in repairing and rebuilding your community. And essentially, investment problem in economics is time related. It's setting aside some resources that you could have consumed in the present time to make yourself more productive in the future. So some examples of resilience. Another one of my themes is that resilience takes place at 3 levels: the individual, business, and household. And some examples are conservation of critical inputs, use of inventories, relocation of business activity. I'll show you a good example of that in a moment. Resilience also takes place at the meso level, and in this case we're talking about markets. And here I'm referring to the efficient allocation of resources via price signals. And what I'm getting at is that in the aftermath of a lot of disasters, you see prices go up. And many people conclude, well, that's gouging. Well, to an economist, that's not quite the case. Prices going up are an indication that resources have become more scarce. And they're a little bit like pain is to the body. They're an indication that there's something wrong, and the market has a self-correcting mechanism when it's working well. And so one can, and we've developed models to separate out that part of price increases in the aftermath of a disaster that are warranted from those which would represent just pure gouging. And what I'm getting at is that the market mechanism is in fact an inherent source of resilience that we often take for granted, but it helps us when we have prices increase of certain critical inputs. It helps us shift our purchases away from the higher priced, more scarce resources to others. And it's one of these self-equilibrating factors associated with resilience. Another example is non-interruptible service premia, which again is the use of the market. And this is where a company pays a little bit more for its electricity on an ongoing basis to be established as a priority customer in case there's a shortage. We also have regional and national economic resilience at the macro level, and here I'm talking about countervailing policies such as fiscal and monetary policy. So after 9/11, the Federal Reserve Bank, essentially Federal Reserve Board, provided $100 billion worth of funds for interbank loan shortages that helped soften the blow. And the policy also was to keep interest rates low to help stimulate the economy. And another thing you can do is import scarce commodities from outside the region. All of this is consistent with a paradigm shift in what we call hazard loss estimation, which is the way that scientists, engineers, social scientists have tried to evaluate the losses from natural disasters and various other types of economic disruptions over the last 20 years. This field was dominated by engineers, and not surprisingly, the focus was on property damage. And everything else was considered an indirect loss. But we've made a lot of inroads into that, to what is now called economic consequence analysis. And the fact of the matter is that the focus has shifted. So we can't prevent all disasters or terrorist attacks, but we can reduce some losses after the attack occurs. And an important distinction you see in the first chapter of every economics textbook is the difference between stocks and flows. And the important thing is you have to keep those distinct, and they can't readily be added. So an example of a stock is property. and the counterpart for loss estimation would be property damage. On the other hand, an asset, which is sort of capital and prime example of a stock, yields a flow of goods and services over time, and this is what our well-being is really dependent on. So usually when one sees economic indicators and the effects, how well the economy is doing, we don't provide a number which tells you what the total capital stock of the U.S. is. But in fact, we talk about what the GDP is and how fast it's growing or what the employment level is. So the essence is that the focus has shifted from property damage to business interruption. Property damage takes place at a given point in time, and then it's a done deal. But the thing about business interruption, that flow, is it just starts at that point and it continues until you've recovered. So it's a longer-term phenomenon. It is, in fact, more complicated because it has behavioral dimensions, and it's greatly affected by policy decisions, both in the private sector and the public sector. So one of the implications of all of this is that I am referring to resilience primarily as actions that we take after the disaster is struck to reduce losses. We can't reduce property damage. Again, it's a done deal, but we can reduce business interruption, and that is the focus. I might say, in talking to people in various disciplines, there's a split. There are half the people that I've talked to who include in resilience anything you do to reduce losses, especially mitigation. And if you're an engineer, I can understand that perspective. But the other half have concluded, well, there's a perfectly good word for what you do to reduce losses before the event, and that's mitigation. What we need is a good term to explain what we do after the event, which is less obvious to people. It has been until recently. And that is what I'm reserving resilience for. Now, I might say it's not quite that open and shut. Resilience is also a process. And what I mean is that you can, in fact, build up resilience capacity before the event. You can increase your inventories. You can have drills. But resilience is not actually implemented until after the event has taken place. So that's when you use those inventories. That's when you implement and actually go through those drills. There are many motivations for resilience, but one of the major ones is self-reliance. And from an economist standpoint, business survival is quite a motivation in normal times, not to mention crises. And so firms have been found to cope pretty well with crises, mainly for reasons of survival, and it's true of households too. In addition, what's happened over the last 10 years is the increase in the number of major disasters has created kind of a vacuum, and just as nature abhors a vacuum, so does the economic system. So people will rush in if they see a need for their service, and what we've had spawned is a new business continuity industry, which are specialists in relocating your firm, in backing up your IT, in cleaning up, and this is a growing area. So a large company like IBM is going to have its own division of continuity, business continuity, disaster response, but small firms need help, and so you have this business continuity industry, which is a major source of resilience. In other words, what I'm saying is there's an entire industry that has been established to promote resilience. And again, this is part of the inherent workings of our economy, and I haven't made the distinction too explicit just yet, but there is another major distinction that I've made, and that's between inherent resilience, that's built into the system, and adaptive resilience. That's the ingenuity that, in fact, comes when you are faced with recovering from the disaster. And finally, businesses don't operate in isolation. There is the realization that, you're only as resilient as your supplier, for example. And a classic example, going back to this non-interruptible service contracts, is that San Francisco Airport for years paid this non-interruptible service premium, figuring, well, we'll be a priority customer when there's an outage. And Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 turned out their major supplier of jet fuel did not pay the interruptible interruptibility premium, and that caused a near disaster. So this brings a couple of these concepts together, but the important thing is that business is not only looking at its own resilience, but coordinating efforts with other members of its supply chain in coping with these problems. At the macro level, here is yet another example of resilience relating to governments, and its pooling of resources between communities is yet another way that we can become more resilient as a society. So let me next offer an operational metric of direct economic resilience. And this is a simple definition. I put it forth 8 years ago, and I said, hey, we need to get started trying to measure resilience in a concrete way. I offer this as a straw man. I encourage people to come up with more sophisticated approaches. But the essence here is that direct economic resilience is the maximum loss minus the actual loss divided by the maximum loss. So in essence, direct economic resilience is the percent of losses that you've been able to avoid, the percentage of the maximum disruption to a given shock that you're able to avoid. So let me illustrate this. A few years ago, I had the privilege of coordinating 8 studies, including one of my own, to come up with a definitive estimate of the economic impacts of 9/11. And let me give you an example of the importance of business relocation in excess office space, excess capacity, as a form of resilience. So the World Trade Center area housed more than 1,100 businesses. This also includes government agencies as well. High proportion in the finance area. But less than 5% of those businesses failed. Nearly all of them relocated, and nearly all of them in the New York area. And this demonstrated incredible resilience. And what I'd like to do then is to show you how I can, in fact, apply that definition to this case in point. So again, 95% of the World Trade Center area firms relocated after 9/11. If all of those firms would have gone out of business, the direct business interruption, sales revenue or net number GDP loss would have been $58.4 billion. On the other hand, if all the relocation were immediate, the loss would have been pretty close to zero. It turned out, though, that relocation is not immediate, and we surveyed businesses, found most of them were able, 90% relocated between 3 and 4 months, and that generated a business interruption of 16.1. So the resilience metric is the avoided loss divided by the maximum potential loss, and the avoided loss is this 42.3, which is 58.4 minus 16.1, and it's divided by the maximum potential loss had there been no relocation. So we say that the effectiveness of relocation as a resilience tactic was 72%. It was able to reduce 72% of the potential losses from 9/11. While I'm at it, let me talk just a little bit about the overall resilience. Many people don't realize this, but some of bin Laden's major statements before 9/11 was that one of his major goals was to wreck the U.S. economy. It's one of the reasons he chose the Trade Center, perhaps, instead of the Statue of Liberty. But the impacts were rather small. The losses were muted by direct and total local resilience, such as the relocation I've mentioned, muted significantly by national resilience in the form of the Federal Reserve Bank and fiscal and monetary policy in general. But an interesting thing is the losses were, in fact, exacerbated by fear. So while I'm talking a lot about resilience, the opposite of resilience is the fear that is instilled by natural disasters and terrorist attacks that rattle us and cause us to be just the opposite. So the largest single aspect or impact of 9/11 was a fear factor, and it was responsible for 80% of this $109 billion GDP loss. This is my estimate. It's on the high side of the scale of the 8 studies. And this resulted from an almost 2-year downturn in airline travel and related tourism. People were afraid to get on an airplane. And that's what caused the largest part of the losses. So the bottom line is that 9/11 did not have a destabilizing effect on the economy of New York or the U.S. And for primarily the resilience strategies I mentioned, but also because fortunately fear does dissipate. And I can refer you to a recent article in Risk Analysis on a dirty bomb attack in the LA Financial District where we quantified that. In effect, I've done studies, and I'll show you other examples, where resilience can reduce losses by 75 to 90%, fairly large amount. On the other hand, fear from social amplification of risk and stigma effects we found in our example can increase the losses 15-fold. Total economic resilience, as opposed to the direct one I just mentioned, relates to off-site considerations that affect resilience. And these are things like infrastructure system interdependence, supply chain, both upstream and downstream that I mentioned, community institutional systems, and affect those impacts that affect the entire economy of a region or nation. So that fear factor that I mentioned, people not wanting to get on an airplane, and again, just at the margin, was in fact a national phenomenon. But essentially, these are simple extensions of the metric of direct economic resilience, which we can measure as well. Let me give you some other examples of our research in measuring economic resilience. And I might say that I'm not going to present you the details of the modeling, but most of the models we use are what are called computable general equilibrium models. And these actually do fit into the complexity theme that is very strong at Santa Fe, in that they characterize the economy as a set of interdependent supply chains and examine those through the workings of markets and prices and behavioral motivations of individual businesses and households. And we found a way to adjust the parameters of those models to reflect resilient conditions in the aftermath of disasters. We use the internal workings of those models in terms of the price system to provide us insight into the effectiveness of the marketplace and price signals in reallocating resources to reduce the losses. So here are two examples of outages of the electricity and water system in Los Angeles County. These were done in the context of a terrorist attack, where resilience is likely to be higher than an earthquake, and I'll explain why. And you can see our estimate of this 2-week outage of electricity was over $20 billion. If, in fact, all the resilience options or tactics were implemented to their fullest, you could reduce that down to a little less than $3 billion. And you've got a similar phenomenon for water. We've also decomposed the effectiveness of various types of resilience. And so what we've got is a decomposition of these resilience effects on the water system and electricity system. You see that conservation of electricity is more effective than for water. Adaptive substitution, that is using bottled water or trucked water in the case of the water service outage, and using, let's say, natural gas instead of electricity. You can't store electricity, but on the other hand, you can store water, and actually this is an underestimate according to our more recent studies. Alternate sources on the electricity side refers to backup generators, which many companies, small companies, have installed in the aftermath of the Northridge earthquake. Larger companies essentially have their own power facilities, and there's increasing amount of distributed generation, mainly through renewables. Production rescheduling, that refers to the possibility and likelihood that once the water or electricity comes back on, you can simply start up the production lines again. If your outage is a short period, your customers aren't going to abandon you. They've got standing orders. They've got inventories of your product, and you're likely to be able to make up a lot of that activity through just working overtime or extra shifts. Now, I mentioned that the resilience is going to be higher for the case of a terrorist attack than an earthquake, and here's why. So the terrorist attack is targeted to the electricity system or the water system, and everything else is intact. And so when you get power back, you start up the production lines. The earthquake, isn't so focused. It's widespread destruction, and so when the power comes back on, your roof may have been, have crumbled into your factory, and you're not going to be able to be as resilient. So production rescheduling has to be modified for the context. It also has to be modified for the length. There is a dissipation. After a couple of months, your customers are going to abandon you. You are going to lose market share, and that production rescheduling is, in fact, going to dissipate. One of the things to emphasize in this context, though, is the cost of resilience. So if we compare resilience to mitigation, often mitigation refers to, in the case of an electric power system or water system, having a backup generator in place or system redundancy, a separate set of water lines or power lines. In fact, in LA, there's a separate set of water lines just for fire production. These are especially expensive. On the other hand, conservation is not at all. In fact, conservation, in terms of what economists call energy efficiency, more than pays for itself. It's getting the same output with less energy, and it's a cost-saving enterprise for the most part. Substitution of inputs has a small penalty. We talk about inventories, but again, an economist will tell you it's not the value of the inventories that's the cost. It's simply the foregone use of those resources or the carrying costs of those inventories, which is a couple of percent. Production rescheduling involves a little bit of overtime pay and a little bit of startup costs. So all of these resilience options are very inexpensive, which is another important thing to keep in mind. The next example I'd like to share with you is a case of resilience to port disruptions. And here we did a study of a boat accident in Port Arthur, Port Beaumont, Texas, a major petroleum refining area, but major port where a lot of tankers come in. And we examined these 6 types of resilience to that port economy, the port and the port economy. And they are listed here, and what I do is talk about them a little bit in the context of our results. So these are the results of a 3-month disruption in Port Arthur, Port Beaumont. The total impacts to the regional economy would, in fact, be on the order of a reduction of almost 54% of its economic activity. What I present in rows B through H are, in fact, the reductions in that disruption due to the various kinds of resilience. And so some that are very effective are production rescheduling, again, ship rerouting to a neighboring port, but where the oil can be, crude petroleum can be piped to refineries there in Port Beaumont. Export diversion, taking what you would have exported and utilizing it locally. Use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which you hear about all the time, is pretty limited and would be pretty meager. Inventories are, in fact, a sizable potential in terms of the storage capacity of these petroleum refineries, especially. On the other hand, conservation doesn't get you very much at all. And all resilience adjustments together, and I should have mentioned this in the previous context as well, are able to reduce those losses from 54.9% to 42.2%, and I guess the math is around 75% improvement. Note that all resilience adjustments together is not additive. There are overlaps that are involved. But you can see that resilience, in fact, and again, this is a simulation, as were the cases that we talked about before, but I've done studies of resilience in the aftermath of the Northridge earthquake and other actual events, as I did with 9/11, and we have pretty significant findings in terms of resilience. But one caveat, the work on the hypothetical events, we have typically assumed, let's say, the maximum implementation of resilience, and I think we need to refine that in the future to, let's say, more realistic amounts of resilience as they've taken place. But even with that, I think it's safe for me to say that resilience can reduce our losses, our economic losses, pretty sizably. Some of the implications of this are that many effective resilience tactics do exist, that customers, which is all of us, have many more options than suppliers in terms of market orientation of resilience. And resilience has two major cost advantages over mitigation. One I've mentioned to you before is that there are many inexpensive options. The other is that you don't have to implement resilience until after the event has occurred. Mitigation, you have to build seawalls, put them in place. The disaster may never strike. You don't want to say that's wasted money, but it may not come into play. On the other hand, resilience, some of it is, increasing resilience capacity, but a lot of it is something that you don't have to bring to bear until afterwards, and so that reduces the cost significantly as well. What about changing resilience? There are several ways we can do that. One is enhancement of resilience, and again, I emphasize that resilience is a process, and those people I work with in organizational behavior, sociology emphasize this much more. You can invest in resilience capacity in advance, so it's not just implementing it after the fact. It's that whole time phasing, that whole decision process to identify alternative sources of resilience, decide which are best, decide what you might be able to do beforehand, decide how to implement it, decide how to come together in implementing resilience. All of that makes it a process. But as I said before, you can invest in resilience capacity in terms of building up your inventories. If you take the broader view of resilience, this would include mitigation. There are information dissemination that you can provide, which will help people after the event, planning and drills, etc. On the other hand, resilience can be eroded. And in looking at a few examples, and I can't say we've done this in a scientific, definitive way, resilience can be eroded with the size and duration of the disaster. There is difficulty in sustaining resilience in terms of people, wearing down and systems wearing down. There are finite capabilities in terms of our excess capacity, in terms of our inventories. We also have highly interdependent infrastructure, which tends to fail in a cascading way even more when we have larger disasters and disasters of longer duration. And this is an example of resilience in the face of catastrophes and how, in fact, it can be eroded. I'm not going to go over every one of these, but for instance, we talk about inherent resource substitution using bottled water for piped water. It has a minor amount of effectiveness, but it's very important in life-sustaining. This is going to be lowered because the substitutes are less available. If we move down, we'll find that if we look at import substitution, both inherent and adaptive, if your transportation system is wrecked, then you're going to be able to, you're less able to effectively access that. Resource inventories are weakened by property damage because your storage facilities are destroyed. And production rescheduling, and the example I gave before, is also likely to be weakened by property damage. Well, let me start to wind down and talk about some alternative definitions. And I apologize, I should have checked my slide. There is some automatic feature in my slide deck. I'm sorry about that. The National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which was formulated a couple of years after 9/11, provided a definition close to mine. Capability of an asset system or network to maintain its function or recover from a terrorist attack or any other incident. So this is a after the event focused definition, again, maintaining function. The DHS lexicon definition, though, is very broad to include mitigation, to resist, absorb, and recover from or successfully adapt to adversity or change in conditions. And there was a discussion yesterday about robustness. Where does robustness fit in? My view is that robustness is primarily an engineering term when we talk about systems, and it's the ability of that system to withstand the initial shock. And that's the limit of it. And then that past that initial shock, you're into the business interruption, the flow losses, and that's where resilience comes into play. The NEHRP definition is broader. Essentially, NEHRP refers to the federal government's programs at natural hazards risk reduction, primarily related to earthquakes, but applied to all hazards, with a big emphasis on mitigation, not surprisingly, because that has been dominated by the engineering community for many years. And as I will mention in a moment, that mitigation is very key in many respects. While I'm at it, and I noted I had a couple of more minutes just to, I do a lot of work on climate change too. And the irony is I really haven't merged my research interest that much. A couple of years ago, I advised a few states on setting up cap and trade systems. The last couple of years, I've done a lot of studies on whether climate action plans are job killers or job creators. So what I'd like to do is take a minute to give my interpretation of three terms that have been mentioned here and their relationship. So yesterday was a discussion of climate change and adaptation. My view, and it's only my view, is that resilience is the short-run counterpart to adaptation. Adaptation is a long-run process by which we use a broader set of mechanisms to slowly reduce those losses and protect society, while resilience, I would prefer, be used to refer to our reaction to shorter-run shocks. Now, what's the relation to climate change? Well, climate change has two dimensions. It's long-term climate change, warming, sea level rise, but it's also short-run climate variability, including the possibilities of increase of your storms, hurricanes, etc. And so their resilience does have a role in the climate change lexicon, but my suggestion is that have that more specialized meaning. One of the keys is to translate resilience into adaptation. And what I mean is that resilience spawns a lot of ingenuity. People in the crisis come up with great ideas that they hadn't thought about before, and the trick is to make those lasting, to make them part of the system, and to turn those into adaptive, long-run adaptive responses. Two more slides. I mentioned before I offered a simple metric of resilience, and I don't want to trivialize resilience or be a reductionist about it, but I think it's an excellent start. But it is important that we consider the various dimensions of resilience in analyzing it. And again, some of this is repetitive. The stock flow distinction is key. We have to keep in mind that it has these behavioral and policy dimensions. There's the static versus dynamic distinction, the fact that resilience takes place at three different levels, that it is contextual in nature. In other words, to make my metric operational, you have to be able to estimate the maximum potential loss as a point of departure. It's important to make a distinction between inherent and adaptive resilience. It's also important to make a distinction between the supply side and demand side of resilience. Keep in mind the costs of implementation. Those are important, but again, resilience is a pleasant surprise in that regard. And then equity implications, in other words, who benefits and who pays for resilience is pretty important too, and has hardly been studied at all. So in conclusion, I have talked about mitigation. I hope nobody thinks I've been bad-mouthing it. Mitigation is essential, and in fact still the key in our first line of defense. And while I've talked about recovering lost production and reducing our losses after the fact, well, that's our economic activity, and that can be redone and recovered to some extent. But on the other hand, life cannot, nor can vulnerable ecosystems. And so mitigation is our first line of defense in protecting those. But resilience is a worthy second line of defense. It's effective, it's low cost, it's self-motivated, it applies to both producers and consumers, which means all of us. And so resilience is yet another way we can all contribute to reducing the threat of disasters. Thank you.
A good survey of what I'd call more or less instantaneous responses and resilience, but it left me thinking that there's sort of another step in thinking about this, which is what we might call hysteresis, the tendency of networks not necessarily to come back to where they were after a shock. And from your examples, I don't know if your research touched on this or it's the next step, did those World Trade Center companies that survived, were there long-term effects, like, for instance, in their market share? Did they lose big market share, or was their business failure rate increased in the out years, that kind of thing? And then sort of at the system level, thinking about 9/11 again, a clear hysteresis effect where the system didn't come back was major increase in security. I think all those guys that look at your IDs in all the office buildings in New York for no apparent reason. And, the growth in the security state where we're spending $30 or $40 billion a year more on snoops and spies than we used to. Where does the network doesn't come back the way it did side of things come into the economic analysis?
Well, let me address your first question. I haven't done a thorough examination of companies' long-term survival, but the anecdotal evidence I've seen is that companies did pretty well in the alternative locations on a longer-term basis. A lot of these are big companies that had multi-city operations, and a lot of companies have moved back into Manhattan that might have moved to New Jersey, and the others just moved to Midtown in the first place. As far as system resilience, well, let me mention one thing. I finessed one thing, because I didn't want to get in a long argument about it right off, and that is what is meant by recovery. So the old-fashioned, unimaginative definition is that you come back to where you were before. But there's a term that's now used, and it's a little catty or kitschy. It's called the new normal. And I hope somebody comes up with a better term, but it's to suggest that coming back to where you were before shouldn't necessarily be your goal. New Orleans is a great example. I think most people suggest that for New Orleans probably couldn't sustain economically the population it had with a high quality of life, and that one shouldn't expect that to be the recovery. So recovery, what the broader definition means is that recovery has a more flexible interpretation, so that if you don't rebuild the system as it was, as vulnerable and flexible as it was, you rebuild the system in a manner that is more resilient for the future. Just as when after an earthquake and you rebuild, you try to build more mitigation into it at the same time. So hopefully that's answered your question. As far as the impacts of 9/11, there's a New York Times article on the 10th anniversary that used my number, but it was dominated by some results by economist Joe Stiglitz and others that looked at the cost of 9/11 not just being the GDP losses of the U.S. economy, but all that the U.S. had been spending on the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And that gets to be, broader political question as to whether that's reasonable or not. And his number was $3 billion, if I didn't mention. $3 trillion. I apologize. $3 trillion. I'm not a rich economist. So after too many zeros, I'm at a loss.
Earlier in your talk, you referred to the market processes as exerting a sort of self-equilibrating function in dealing with disasters. And then in your study of the World Trade Center, you mentioned about how the majority of the economic impacts was a result of fear in the populace.
Right.
And I just was hoping you could elaborate more on those two dimensions of the problem, because I'm not clear on how they relate.
They're opposites, and my colleagues and I have sort of led the charge on saying these two things were really important, but they really are polar opposites. And when we talk about fear, I didn't mean to over-dramatize the fear in this case. It doesn't take much. When I talk about a 2-year down, it was 7 calendar quarter downturn in airline travel and tourism, and we detrended it for the ongoing recession and even got that length of time. It wasn't the mass of the population of the U.S. It was just, a small number, and I'm sorry I can't put it in percentage terms, but even if less 5% of people did not take airplane trips that they had intended, you're going to get that 80 billion. So it's really a small percentage of the population. But there are a lot of insidious agents that are especially worrisome. These are radiological, biological, and chemical mechanisms of either terrorist attacks or things that can be released during a natural disaster. I mean, an example was given about Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and there are other examples. San Onofre, isn't too far from an earthquake fault, San Onofre nuclear power plant. And these can be especially insidious and cause near-term almost panic through the social amplification of risk, partly due to the news media. Some colleagues of mine, like Paul Slovic, have traced newspaper and TV exposure to people's fear, and they track almost perfectly in terms of the social amplification of risk, which has a great effect in the short term, and then there are these long-term stigma effects where people want to stay away from them. What we've done is taken those behavioral responses and translated them in the following way. What premium is a worker going to require to go back to a place that's been hit by biological or radiological attack? What higher rate of return on investment is required? What discount does a shopper require? And all of those translate into costs. And as I said, for this dirty bomb attack on the financial district of Los Angeles, we found that these behavioral impacts were potentially 15 times greater than the ordinary brick and mortar impacts, that an ordinary business interruption from downtime for cleanup that people normally estimate.
A related question comes in from Phil again on the Phil Moyer again on the webcast. Phil observed that many of your examples were of engineered systems, water delivery, ports, etc. And he's also interested in a human-related question, and that is, what about the resilience of and effects on human systems, healthcare delivery, for example?
Well, that's something I haven't studied. There are several people in the social sciences and related fields that work on this. Fran Norris is the leader in community resilience. She has an appointment at Dartmouth in, I think, both the public health school, the medical school, primarily a sociologist. I'd refer you to her work in the health area. Kathleen Tierney, who's the director of the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado at Boulder, a leading sociologist on the subject. Bob Cates, who's emeritus at Brown. These are people to look to for answers on the human, more human side.
Thank you.
Coming back to the fear factor, since it can represent such a large percentage of the potential loss, it seems to me there are certainly cases where we see that it is subject to mitigation itself.
Yes, yes.
So, for instance, the anti-germ sprays that have shown up at all of the supermarkets and things like that, which are very local things that people can do to get rid of that specific type of fear. And we should look at that as a way of possibly introducing
most definitely. And probably the best mechanism for the example I gave is improved risk communication on the part of the government and the private sector. So there's a trade-off. Remember the movie Jaws, where the police chief wanted to close the beach, and for fear in the business community basically said, well, we're going to lose all the revenue, open the beach up. So there's always pressure. Let's say you have a dirty bomb attack, financial district, for the business community would like to open things back up as soon as possible, and you have this tension. But it may not actually be in the long-term best interest of the business community to do that, because if you clean up too rapidly, you may very well not instill the confidence that you've done a thorough job and that there's some kind of lingering contamination. So taking your time may have something to be said for lowering and rapid and more effective risk communication, informing the public exactly what is being done, when, what the risks are, and admitting that there are still some residual risk, and but that's still better than the panic and rumor that spreads. And risk communication is not an expensive enterprise. So it's yet another example of a very low-cost way of reducing losses.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that the DHS definition of resilience that you had up briefly did explicitly talk about successful adaptation to adversity or change. Now, you have brought that up now and then, but I think that a main theme that can run through resilience is the question of what have we learned from a disaster and what have we learned from the response, and keep that as strong an element as the other elements there, so that when you do approach the steady state again, you have built in some clear ideas of the lessons learned, just to put it very simply.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons that we've decomposed the analysis, not just to look at resilience as some amorphous mechanism, but to look at individual resilience tactics in a comparative static manner, and then also in terms of their simultaneity and in their effectiveness, so that we can gauge which are the most effective, put that together with the cost estimate, and you've got a way of, as an economist keeps saying, the old story was how to train it. For an economist, all you need to do is get a parrot and teach them how to say supply and demand. But another one is to talk about, say, reallocation of resources, or basically how best to utilize your resources in the most cost-effective manner to get at reducing your losses.
One could argue that the city of New York is highly resilient. How much of that resilience is due to mitigation versus to its economic and social complexity?
Well, it's going to take me a minute to answer that. So my bias is that resilience is not the same as mitigation. It's the complement to mitigation. It's something you do after the event. In terms of implementing it, you can enhance it before. So it is separate from mitigation. How much of it is due to, let's say, cultural considerations? I'm not an expert in that. I would say economics is part of culture. We live in a free market society with a good amount of sizable public sector and some regulation. It's really a mixed economy. But there is a strong set of individual incentives for all parties. And that's an important part of our culture to survive both as individuals and as businesses. And it has been shown to be the case over and over. And the fact, again, you go back to the 9/11 case, 95% of those businesses survived. Their place of business was gone. They survived. Many of them were relocated within a couple of weeks. That is actually being increased significantly. More businesses are working on having backup sites. Most every business backs up its IT system. They look for backup sites in anticipation. There is the business continuity industry that spawned is going to have more companies there to relocate you, in terms of trucking, transportation. So that's the best I can do.
Yes, Jenny? Yes.
I think as we have the chance to study what happens with Sandy and the recovery from Sandy in the Northeast, we're going to see that there are new alliances between consumers and producers, which is strengthening the resilience at a third level, which probably came about as a result of the prior experiences when they were two separate groups. Right. My question is, do you think it will be possible to measure over time enhanced resilience?
I think it will be, and that actually process started several years ago with Walmart and Lowe's and big outfits like that. And when hurricanes were predicted, making sure they had lumber, additional amounts of lumber in place, plywood, for example, so people could cover their windows and doors and be more resilient against storms, and have more emergency equipment on hand. So again, it's partly business wanting to demonstrate that they're really a part of the community, but it's also a profit motive. I mean, they're able to sell this stuff. Fortunately, they have not done what people feared, and that is raising the price in anticipation. So that's a good thing. But it can be measured.
Other questions? I have one, David, please. Scott. I'm going to change the subject slightly on you, and I apologize for doing so, but I can't resist. I'm interested in the resilience of the economic system itself, and in particular in the wake of the crash of 08-09, and what aspects of the system do you think, looking back, have exhibited unexpected resilience, and what aspects of the system do you think have exhibited unexpected lack of resilience, and what, if anything, should we do about it?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Chris. I'm not qualified to answer it, is the problem. I don't work in the area of finance or macro typically. The one thing I would say is when people are concerned about a recession and the economy, one can't remember, and I focused on the flow aspects for this whole lecture. I'm going to focus on the stock and asset. We've got a downturn, there's a bubble that bursts, and there's a little bit of panic at first. We still have that asset base in place, which is very strong. We still have our human capital in place. Both of those are very strong. Those were not destroyed. Yes, there are paper most everything was paper losses. Yes, the value of homes were lowered, but the factories are intact, our trained labor force is intact, and that goes a long way toward being resilient. Beyond that, as far as financial institutions and macro fiscal and monetary policy, I defer to some other people in the room.
Thank you.
This gets back to a bit to the learning and cultural aspects, and follows up a bit on Chris's last question. Is anyone looking at distinguishing between specific adaptation or resilience and general? And with in the general adaptation, taking a look at economic recoveries and the learning that goes on in periodic small recessions as to having those being fought until they build up to a big one as a learning opportunity.
Well, let me answer the question and stay away from the recession aspect, but I'm glad you asked the the question in relation to disasters, and that is that, and there was an article in Science about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm trying to remember, a person who was at Arizona State and recently moved to Georgia Tech, Allenby, and somebody on resilience, and it actually focused on this question, and that is there are aspects of the way technological change comes about in the U.S. which makes us less or more resilient in terms of interconnectedness. You know, typically is thought, all other things being equal, is making us more vulnerable. And there are opportunities, well, there's some general trend that is associated with technological change, and it remains to be seen whether it makes us more or less resilient. But we have opportunities to build resilience into systems. I think that's the important